Chapter 3, Social Beliefs and Judgments. Chapter 2 had judgments also, but it was about yourself. It was self-judgments, basically. Now we're turning it around and we are looking at other people. We're judging them. We're thinking about how we feel about them. So this is where the fundamental attribution error lies. My whole book, The Power of Context, pretty much focuses on the fundamental attribution error. And now in Chapter 3, I will formally introduce attribution theory, even though we talked about attributions towards self in Chapter 2. And also in Chapter 3, I will formally discuss the ins and outs, the many ins and outs of the fundamental attribution error. So we have Roman numeral 1, explaining other people. That's where I'll introduce attribution theory. Roman numeral 2 is the attributional errors and biases. So that's where the FAE falls, and that's where the actor-observer bias will fall. And we've already talked about both of those, but I will go into more detail here. And then Roman numeral 3 is sort of the miscellaneous category for whatever I want to put into the end of this video lecture having to do with attributions. Now you have 2 articles to read on Canvas, 2 journal articles, and I have a separate video lecture planned for talking about those. That will come after the current video lecture. So I've got my clip art here, right? I've got the guy who's driving so fast that he can't even stay inside the cab of the car. I've showed you that clip art before. And then all these other clip arts just refer to how it's harder than we think to accurately judge other people. We make mistakes. Most of us, at least some of the time, are biased. We make mistakes. And I don't know if I've talked to you much about Star Trek before. I'm into Star Trek, and this is one of my few clip arts with Star Trek characters. This is from the TV show Star Trek Next Generation. Captain Picard, Commander Riker. Somebody screwed up. They know it. Okay, attribution theory. That's about explanations, right? An attribution is an explanation. Now, in the thousands of articles and maybe even thousands of books on attribution theory over the last, say, 100 years, one of the focuses, one of the foci, one of the places researchers have focused is in understanding why we make attributions. Isn't that kind of funny? Attributions are answering the question, why do people behave the way we do? Why do people behave the way they do? And attribution theorists, they're asking, why do people ask the question, why do other people behave the way they do anyway? In terms of why we make attributions, pause the video and think about this. An attribution is an explanation that includes judgments. So, why do I talk about Star Trek? Why did that person trip on the sidewalk if you see them trip on the sidewalk? Why did a certain political event happen? On January 6th, there was a riot at the Capitol and people died. Why did that happen? So these are attributions. Why do I talk about Star Trek? That is, you're wondering, why does Dr. Stalder talk about Star Trek? Or you see somebody trip on the sidewalk, why'd that person trip? Or you watch on TV the riot and you ask, oh my gosh, why is this happening? And now what we're discussing on the slide is, why do we ask those questions? Why do we care? Why do we make attributions in the first place? So thinking about those examples, or taking a step back and thinking about your own examples, why do we do it? So yet again, I like to talk about how it would be if we were in a face-to-face class. And you know, maybe sometime I'll set up a few discussion boards on Canvas where you can get a few points. I'll get back to you on that. One maybe simplistic answer is curiosity. Human beings are curious. Maybe it's an evolutionary thing, because maybe if we were not curious, we wouldn't have survived as well as a species. But it's just intellectual curiosity. Why? I just want to know. A more complicated answer, and probably more relevant to most of the examples that we can think of, is that making attributions increases our perceived control. Oh, by the way, do you guys recognize Curious George? That little monkey? Do they still make Curious George toys and things? I know I might be dating myself, maybe. So the thing about an attribution is that it can, and it often does, increase perceived control. Now there are at least two very important points I want to make about that phrase, increases perceived control. Point number one, increases. Does that refer to a comparative statement or an absolute statement? Do you remember that point of logic? Comparative statements are not absolute. They're not about absolute amounts. And so when I say attributions increase our perceived control, am I saying that attributions make us feel in control? That if we make an attribution, that person's tripping because they're clumsy? Dan talks about Star Trek so much because he must love it. Are those attributions, do they make us feel in control? Why did those people riot at the Capitol on January 6th? Because they are bloodthirsty demons? Because they're patriots who felt that their government was failing them? Okay, whatever your explanations, am I saying that those explanations make us feel in control of life? That they make us feel in control of these bad things that could happen? No, that would be an absolute statement, right? I'm sorry, that took me about 90 seconds to make my point. Comparative statements are not absolute. So just because I say it increases our perceived control doesn't mean that I'm saying it makes us feel in control. No, that doesn't necessarily make us feel in control, but it makes us feel in more control than had we not made the attribution, compared to if we just sat there not knowing or feeling like we don't know. The second point I want to make about my phrase here, increases perceived control, is that it is perceived control. Does it actually increase control? Yeah, maybe sometimes. But the relevant issue here is that it makes us feel more in control. It's perceived. And what a lot of psychologists and psychotherapists will tell you is that it's probably more important that you feel in control than you actually are in control. Of course, if you are in control, that would probably make you feel in control. But the issue is that even if you're not in control, even if you don't feel any kind of control, what I mean is even if you're not in control, even if there is no control that you have over the bad things that could happen to you, feeling like you have control, that perceived control, is what keeps us mentally healthy. That's one of the issues here. Feeling in control reduces the risk of depression. Just like all those self-serving biases in Chapter 2 reduce the risk of depression, making attributions in general increases perceived control, and increasing perceived control makes us feel more mentally healthy. It's reducing the risk of depression. In other words, people who don't feel any control over the bad things that happen in life, people who don't feel that control, they're more likely to get depressed. Now I need to throw in something here to elaborate on perceived control, and it is called the just world hypothesis. Have you heard of this before? Just world beliefs, or the just world hypothesis. This refers to the common belief that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. The just world hypothesis. Because if you live in a world that is just, if you live in a world that has justice, well then good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. That's just. That's justice. When bad things happen, it's because they deserve it in some way. When bad things happen to people, it's because they're bad people. They screwed up. They deserve it. And then when good things happen, well, then you must have done something to deserve that also. That's the just world hypothesis. Why am I talking about it on this slide? The belief that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, that increases perceived control. Why did this bad thing happen to this person? Well, because they deserved it. That's the attribution. That makes us feel more in control. How is that? So let me ask you to imagine that your neighbor has lost his home to foreclosure. And you like your neighbor, and you think your neighbor is a smart person, and your neighbor works hard, and yet he lost his home to foreclosure. This is terrible because he has a family, and maybe they're going to have to go on food stamps, and maybe I'm exaggerating this a little bit, but my point is that when bad things happen to good people, we get confused, we get stressed, we get scared, partly because when bad things happen to good people, we might get afraid that something bad could happen to us. Because I'm a good person. My neighbor's a good person. I'm a good person. And this good person who I know, my neighbor, something bad just happened to this good person. How is that possible? I'm a good person too. Does that mean that can happen to me? Does that mean I can lose my home to foreclosure? Oh my God. And so as I start to feel this drain on my perceived control, I'm motivated to make a simple attribution. My neighbor must have screwed up somehow. Maybe my neighbor is not as smart as I thought he was. Maybe my neighbor is not as hardworking as I thought he was. Now listen, I'm not saying that I liked my neighbor and now I hate my neighbor. That would be an extreme reaction. But maybe I liked my neighbor and I thought he was smart and I thought he was hardworking, and now I think, well, I guess he's not as hardworking as I thought he was. I guess he's not as smart as I thought he was. He must have screwed up in some way. I mean, why did he spend so much money on this house? He should have not spent so much money on this house. And, why didn't he put more money away so he could handle the payments? And so I start generating these reasons so that the world is just again, so that the world makes sense again. So let me just take this opportunity to show you. This is the chapter 8 I was just talking about. And here on page 204, the just world belief, the just world hypothesis. And I will talk about this chapter a little later in this video lecture. So we're back to the slide. And just to summarize, it's hard for most of us to accept the lack of control that we have, or the relative lack of control that we have over some of the bad things that could happen to us. It's hard for us to accept the lack of justice, that bad things can happen to good people. And so that motivates us to blame the victim. And that is a form of the fundamental attribution error. To say that this person's outcome is caused by this person's not working that hard, this person not being as smart as I thought they were, that's a form of the fundamental attribution error. So this is just one slide. We spent like 20 minutes here. I tried to give you some call-outs to encourage you to write some other things down. But this is the beginning of attribution theory and some of why we make attributions. Attribution theory, as I said, is the oldest core theory, thousands of studies, many principles, including the discounting principle. Now, when I first started teaching social psychology many years ago, I talked about many of the principles, but I've streamlined it a little bit in recent years, and so let's just talk about the discounting principle. It's one of the most important principles in attribution theory, and it goes as follows. The more reasons you can think of for somebody's behavior, the more reasons you can think of for somebody's behavior, the less confident you are about any single reason. The more reason you can think of, the more reasons you can think of for somebody's behavior, the less confident you are about any single reason. In other words, the more reasons you can think of, the more you can discount any single reason. That's the discounting principle. So let me give you an example. That crazy driver, the one who tailgates you and cuts you off that I've talked about before, why did he do that? Why did this driver drive this way? Let's say I just got cut off by this driver, and you ask me, wow, Dan, you almost died. Why do you think that driver did that to you? And I would say, well, he's a jerk. And you can say, well, how confident are you, Dan? And I can say, I'm 100%, you know what? I'm 110% confident that he is a jerk, that he is an evil demon from hell, because I almost died. On the other hand, suppose I'm what you call attributionally complex. Do any of you remember reading about attributional complexity and the power of context? So you should have read about attributional complexity. And one of the things about attributional complexity is that people who are attributionally complex, they can come up with lots of reasons. And so if I'm attributionally complex and you ask me, why did that driver do that to you, Dan? I could say, well, maybe he's a jerk, or maybe he was in a hurry to get somewhere, you know, like a medical emergency, or maybe there was a mechanical problem, maybe his side view mirrors, you know, are broken because somebody, you know, crashed into his car last week because he doesn't, you know, live in a great part of town, and so he didn't see me. That's why he almost cut me off. And okay, shut up, Dan. Stop talking. Is it really possible there could be that many reasons? I don't know, but an attributionally complex person will think of that many reasons. So now, ask me how confident I am that he's a jerk. Well, how confident are you that he's a jerk? Well, you know, he almost killed me, so I'm still, you know, I'm 90%, okay, 88% confident that he's a jerk. So you see what happened? The more reasons I can come up with, the more I will discount that he's a jerk. That's the nature of the discounting principle. And then I also slipped in there a discussion about attributional complexity. The attributional complexity issue is really interesting, though, because even though in my example, as an attributionally complex person, I was less likely to say he was a jerk, as you may remember from the power of context, people who are attributionally complex are actually slightly more prone to the fundamental attribution error. It's a complicated literature. I'd love to talk to you one-on-one about it sometime. So most of my lecture is on attributional errors and biases, so let's get to it. And most of my book, The Power of Context, is about attributional errors and biases. And so, as you may remember from the syllabus, you do have a lot of pages to read from The Power of Context in this part of the lecture. Moving on, of course, the fundamental attribution error. I'm so sorry if anyone's getting overwhelmed by the FAE, because I've already talked about it a lot, and now I am formally covering it where it belongs in Chapter 3. So this is where we overestimate personal characteristics, right? We underestimate the situation, but we overestimate personal characteristics. Underestimate the power of context, overestimate the power of the individual, the power of the personality traits. Now, despite it being an error and despite it being a bias, it could be adaptive. I mean, there may be a reason that people so naturally commit the fundamental attribution error. And not all of us do, but most of us do, at least a little. But it could be adaptive. Pause the video. Think about the benefits of the FAE. Think about the pros in terms of the pros and the cons of the FAE. Think about the pros. Why is it a good thing? Well, it could be adaptive. It's fast. It frees up brain space. You know, I want you to time me. Suppose that I almost get killed on the highway because of that jerk, that driver that cut me off. And I want you to time me. Ask me why he did that to me. Okay, so you say, why did he do that to me? Okay, start the timer. What a jerk. Okay, how long did that take me? Like less than a second, right? It's fast. It's fast. And then, you know, you can go on with your life. You know, what a jerk. And then you can worry about the other things that you were worrying about while you were driving. As I've alluded to, it increases perceived control. Attributions in general increase perceived control. The FAE in particular seems to do that. Now remember what I said about comparative statements are not absolute? You might wonder, what about he's a jerk makes me feel more in control? I mean, if I'm driving on the highway and I almost die because some jerk cuts me off, and I say, what a jerk, how does that make me feel in control? Okay, but it doesn't make me feel in control. It makes me feel more in control compared to if I just sat there in the car wondering what the heck happened. I don't know why I got driven off the road. I have no idea. That state makes me feel less in control than thinking that he's a jerk. Because I think he's a jerk, well, then I could just try to avoid jerks, right? When actually it might be more complicated. I might get run off the road for reasons beyond just being with jerks on the road, right? Now, a third reason the FAE could be adaptive is because it reduces stress. Now, this is particularly in victim blaming, in terms of explaining why people lose their homes to foreclosure, why people end up homeless on the street, why people get into accidents. I don't know if you thought about this, but when people get caught in disasters and natural disasters, like in Louisiana years ago in the flood, other people in the country kind of blame the victims sometimes, like, well, why didn't you just evacuate? You know, you didn't have to be in the city in New Orleans when the flood came. Why don't you just evacuate? Now, it's stressful watching people suffer and watching people lose their homes. And so by committing the FAE, by saying, well, they did it to themselves, that actually reduces stress. As we've alluded to before, that stress may arise from the low perceived control. Like, oh my gosh, I don't want this to ever happen to me. I'm a good person. I don't want these bad things to happen to me. So the stress may arise from low perceived control. The stress may arise from the violation of the just world beliefs. Bad things don't happen to good people in a just world. So I'm feeling stress. Okay, when I see something bad happen to a good person, my perceived control is decreasing. My just world beliefs are being violated. And you know what? Maybe there's just a basic empathy component here. You know, I'm a human being. I feel empathy, and I'm just feeling stress from that. So there's a little bit of review here. But the point is that the FAE, it's fast, makes us feel relatively more in control, and it can reduce stress in some cases. So cool. Let's commit the FAE. There are some benefits. But there are also costs. There are also bad parts of the FAE. Obviously, the FAE is an error, and so there are some cons. There are some negative consequences. Now, the way I've decided to talk about the negative consequences is to talk about the benefits to reducing the FAE. Because if the FAE has negative consequences, then let's reduce it. And ultimately, that is the point of my book, The Power of Context. Let's reduce the FAE. Weighing all the pros and the cons, I think it's probably still better to reduce the FAE because there are more cons, or because the cons are more consequential. So here are some of the main benefits of reducing the FAE. Number one, it can reduce anger and retaliation. Let's go back to the highway. If I get cut off by that jerk, and I'm 110% sure that he's a jerk, I'm probably going to be more angry, and I'm probably going to want to retaliate. I don't know if you ever felt this way. Has anyone ever felt anger and a desire to retaliate on the highway when someone does something crazy and almost causes an accident? Do you kind of want to step on the gas and chase this person down? You know, give them a taste of their own medicine? By the way, law enforcement officials say don't do that, right? Don't take the law into your own hands. But my point is that committing the FAE after somebody mistreats you, committing the FAE after somebody talks down to you, that makes you angry and that makes you want to retaliate. And so if we can reduce the FAE, that will reduce the anger and reduce the retaliation. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes we have to stand up for ourselves, and anger is good. But what if we misunderstood? If we misunderstood a situation, then the anger and the retaliation, not good, right? Because you're going to cause harm unnecessarily. But you can reflect on this issue in terms of your own examples. Another benefit of reducing the FAE is that it could prevent future mistreatment. I have some clip art here about bullying, and I'll talk to you about that. But let's stop talking about driving, and let's talk about a different example, like bullying. I'm sorry, it's kind of a dark, big example, but think about a bully, and think about what a bully does to other people. What a nasty kid, right? So let's not excuse the bully, let me just get that out in the open. We're not about to excuse the bully, but let's try to explain the bully. Ultimately, you want to stop the bullying, right? You want to reduce the bullying. And what some research has shown, what some wide-scale, long-term research has shown, is that when you have a bullying situation, it's not as simple as, oh, the bully is a jerk. Oh, the bully is mean. The bully is vicious. I mean, those things are true, but usually there's some other things going on. Usually there are additional things going on, like in the home of the bully, in other aspects of the bully's life. Maybe the bully has some other things going on cognitively. And so if you address the broader issues, the environmental issues, the school context in which it happens, the home context that the bully comes from, that's the best way to reduce the bullying. Long-term, wide-scale research has shown, that is, research that involves school districts, district-wide efforts to reduce bullying. They are successful to a degree. I've seen some success rates like up to 50% reductions in bullying when you attack the multiple causes, and not just that the bully is a jerk and should get detention and should be kicked out of school. When you look at the broader issues, you have more success. So my point is that if you commit the FAE, you're less likely to prevent future mistreatment because you're less likely to fully understand the mistreatment. So let's reduce the FAE, let's better understand the mistreatment, and then we have a better chance of preventing future mistreatment. So I apologize for the dark example. I hope it made sense. So we've got two benefits so far. Another benefit I hope you recall has to do with helping people in need. If you can reduce the FAE, that will increase willingness to help people in need. Do you remember from the very beginning of the semester, I talked about how if you think victims brought it on themselves, you're less willing to help them. Do you remember that from the first week? If you think victims bring their negative outcomes on themselves, then most of us are less willing to help those victims. Okay, well, thinking a victim brought it on themselves, that's the FAE. And so if we can reduce the FAE, that should increase the willingness to help those people who are in need. Now, if I ask you about this on the next exam, if I ask you for the three benefits, you cannot just say increase willingness to help people, because that's not the benefit. The benefit is not increasing willingness to help people. The benefit is increasing willingness to help people who are in need. It's because the people are in need, it's because the people are victims in a sense, that the FAE gets triggered. Do you remember how when we see victims, we're motivated to blame them because it'll reduce stress, etc.? So you have to give me the whole benefit, increasing willingness to help those who are in need, because it's when people who are in need that many of our brains get triggered into blaming those people. And that's the context, that's the time that we have to reduce the FAE if we want to achieve this benefit. Now I've got a picture of a homeless shelter or a food shelter here as just an example of how you can help people in need. And less fundamental attribution error increases the volunteer rates to go to places like food shelters and help out. Okay, if you believe me that reducing the FAE is the way to go, then the next question is, how can we reduce the FAE? So here are some pages in The Power of Context that you have to read. There are like 14 or 15 ways to reduce the FAE that you're going to read about. And I think I have 6 or 7 of those ways here on the slide. For example, education. Oh yeah, education. Good answer. It's almost always the answer to these types of questions. Specifically, you can educate people about the FAE. That's one of the things you can educate people about. Teach them about what the FAE is and some of the research in this video lecture. So that's one thing you can educate people about. A second thing you can educate people about is the situational factors that often get overlooked. What are those situational factors? When someone loses their home to foreclosure, well, if they didn't screw up, then why did they lose their home to foreclosure? Well, it turns out there are some very large hard to control economic forces sometimes that can cause more foreclosures. You know, like when the housing bubble burst about 10 years ago or 12 years ago. That's just one example. And then if you're interacting with a driver on the road who's driving crazy, maybe you didn't realize that women do sometimes give birth in cars on the way to the hospital, and maybe you didn't know that. And so in a way, I sort of educated you about that because my brother, his wife, happened to give birth in a car. Okay, so educated about two things, the FAE and the actual situational factors. So that's one way to reduce the FAE. Check out my turtle action. Okay, I'm kind of proud of that. If you can slow down your thinking, that will reduce the FAE. Specifically, what I mean by slow down is to reserve judgments. Now, I don't know if you've heard this phrase, reserve judgments, before. Let's make sure it's clear in your mind, reserving judgments does not mean never judging. Actually, reserving judgments means waiting to make a firm judgment. Hold off just, for a minute or an hour. Let it simmer. Try to relax. Try not to make decisions when you're angry. Try to relax. Maybe you can gather some more information before you have to make a final judgment. So if your goal is to reduce the FAE, slowing down is the way to do it. But don't get me wrong, sometimes you cannot slow down. Sometimes you have to make a decision quickly, right? Sometimes you're at a party and that special someone comes up to you and asks you out, and you have to decide right then what you're going to do. So sometimes you have to make quick decisions. But if you don't have to make a quick decision, slowing down will help to reduce the FAE. So I'm just going to list these here. Turns out that if you can increase accountability for attributions, that reduces the FAE. And what this mainly means is that you want to make people justify their attributions. If people think they have to justify their attributions, it turns out they're less likely to commit the FAE. If you train the perceiver in logical reasoning, that will reduce the perceiver's FAE. If you can train the perceiver in empathy, that will reduce the perceiver's FAE. This last one, it's a little controversial. What I mean is it's a little sad to think this is necessary, but it turns out that if you make the perceiver sad, that can reduce the FAE. Sadness reduces the FAE. It's ironic. It's sad. I can't recall how much I've talked to you about this. We're definitely going to talk about it later in Chapter 3, that happiness increases the FAE, sadness decreases the FAE. And the issue seems to be that when you're happy, you pay less attention to the situation. But when you're sad, you pay more attention to the situation. It has to do with cognitive attention. It has to do with what your brain is capable of perceiving in that moment. All right, so I've got 6 ways to reduce the FAE on this slide. There are like 9 more in the book, so you should check them all out. And among these 6, my least favorite is making the perceiver sad, right? I mean, if you're a parent and you want to raise your kids not to commit the FAE, if you're a parent and you want to raise your kids not to commit this bias, don't make them sad if you can help it, right? Go with one of these others. Train them in empathy, train them in logic, try to get them to slow down, try to make them explain their attributions to you. These are better ways to go, in my opinion, just because, sadness is not a happy emotion. It's not comfortable for most people. Okay, so we have been talking about the pros and the cons of the fundamental attribution error. And I've tried to make the point or the argument that the cons outweigh the pros, the negative consequences outweigh the benefits of the FAE, and so we should try to reduce it. And so after we talked about the pros and cons, we've talked about how to reduce the FAE. Now, just because there's a list of 14 or 15 ways to reduce the FAE, that doesn't mean it's always easy. And what about trying to help other people reduce the FAE? So this next slide talks about challenges in reducing other people's FAE. So like a family member or a friend, you see them committing the FAE, or you think they might be committing the FAE and you want to help. Well, there are some challenges in that. So friends, family, coworkers. Coworkers, you might especially want to be careful about. You know what? Family members, you know what? It's just challenging. It's just challenging. Telling other people that they're making a mistake, communicating or conveying or implying that other people are making a mistake, that could be challenging. Do you see how that might be challenging? Let's suppose your friend comes to you and complains about her jerk boss who yelled at her. Just an example that I commonly use. So let's say my friend comes to me and she's like, my boss is such a jerk. I didn't do anything wrong and he yelled at me again today. Made me feel really bad about myself. Now let's say I know some things about her boss because she's been telling me about her boss for a while, but she's my best friend, and so I don't want to like come on really strong. But if I tell her that maybe her boss is having a hard home life, or didn't you tell me that your boss was getting a divorce, or maybe your boss's boss yelled at your boss. Okay, well, my friend might feel criticized. Basically, if my friend thinks I'm telling her she's wrong, she might feel an ego threat, and I wouldn't blame her for not enjoying that feeling. But it's not just about ego threat. My friend might feel betrayed. Did anyone think about that possibility? I mean, this is my best friend, let's say, and she might think, how can you take my boss's side? And I would be like, no, I'm not taking your boss's side. I'm trying to help you, not feel those negative consequences of the FAE. So I want to give you time to write this down. Of course, you can pause it. But the thing about trying to reduce other people's FAE is that you're trying to help them avoid those negative consequences of the FAE. One of the negative consequences of the FAE is to feel the anger, to feel a desire to retaliate, and that's probably not good, at your workplace. You don't want to retaliate against your boss. Another negative consequence of the FAE is that it prevents future mistreatment. Okay, so if the boss is mistreating my friend, and we can reduce the FAE, if the FAE is what's going on, then maybe we can help my friend's situation better to prevent future mistreatment, not feel the anger or the hostility that might be arising. So I could be telling my friend, no, I'm not taking your boss's side, and it's too late. It's too late. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do any of you have friends? I mean, once you cross that line, I mean, they're angry, they're sad. They came to you for support. My friend came to me for support, and I sounded like I was taking my boss's side. So this is one of the challenges. Now, one of the things my friend might be doing here is what's called dichotomous thinking. Have you heard of dichotomous thinking before? One of the classic examples of dichotomous thinking is you're either with me or against me. It's a dichotomy. Dichotomy meaning this or that, either or. It's called either or thinking, all or nothing thinking, dichotomous thinking. And particularly if my friend is upset, she might be thinking dichotomously. You're either with me or against me, Dan, and you're definitely not sounding like you're with me. So be prepared for that if you're going to try to help somebody else in this way. And definitely try to communicate in some way that explaining is not excusing. Do you remember that point of logic? Your boss is a jerk. Your boss should not treat you like this. Shame on your boss. I'm not excusing your boss. Your boss should not treat you that way. I don't care if your boss's boss yelled at your boss. I don't care if your boss is going through a divorce. They have to not take it out on their employees, right? Explaining is not excusing. Now, I don't know your best friends. I don't know how you would best communicate any of this to them. You have to make those decisions. Maybe it's just not even worth getting into. Maybe if my friend comes to me with a story like this, I just have to say, wow, your boss is a jerk, I'm so sorry, and leave it at that. Or maybe say, wow, your boss is a jerk, I'm so sorry. Let's go get a coffee or something, and maybe in a half an hour after my friend relaxes a little bit, then maybe I can bring up the issues of the FAE. And I encourage you not to use the word FAE when you're talking to your friend, right? You don't necessarily want to come off as some kind of a arrogant intellectual. Oh, this is the fundamental attribution error. I've read about this in class. Maybe some of you have friends who would like to know if you've read about things in class like this, but maybe not. I did have a student many years ago, and she and her friends did start enjoying calling each other out on the FAE. So this is a true story. I think her name was Justine. It was a long time ago. And she would catch her friends committing the FAE, and they would catch her committing the FAE, and it became kind of a thing. And I don't know if that sounds like fun, but it could be beneficial, except for these side effects here on this current slide, where your friend might feel criticized, your friend might feel betrayed. So those are real challenges. Now, because we have that second book, The Power of Context, I do have some special cases of the FAE to highlight here. For example, in The Power of Context, PC, Power of Context, pages 68 to 72, the book discusses cases of the FAE committed by actual social psychologists. Now, I'm a social psychologist, and my wife has caught me committing the FAE. I'm not immune to bias. I'm a human being. And social psychologists in general are human beings. For example, there's this one famous social psychologist. Her name is Carol Dweck. And you don't need to know her name. But she often interprets giving up behavior as being caused by a fixed mindset. Have any of you heard of the growth mindset? How important it is to have a growth mindset, to believe that you can grow. Having a growth mindset is having the belief that you can grow, you can improve. That if you're not doing well in a course, you can figure out a way to do better. That your intelligence is not fixed. You can grow, you can improve. That's a growth mindset. And Dweck often talks in her TED Talks or in her books, she often talks as if when someone's giving up. I don't know if you can imagine a friend or a classmate who's giving up, who just says, screw this, I'm done, I'm never going to be good at this. It happens in math classes too often, unfortunately. I'm never going to be good at math. I hate this, I hate school. So if you see a friend or if you see a classmate exhibiting giving up behavior, why are they exhibiting giving up behavior? What is the attribution to make here? Why are they exhibiting? Why are they giving up? Okay, well, Dweck often says it's because of their fixed mindset. Now, that is an internal attribution. That's a personality attribution. And it's ironic because Dweck is a social psychologist, so she must know about the fundamental attribution error. She must know, hold on, be careful. Try not to underestimate the possibility of situational factors behind the giving up behavior. So I would put it to you, my students, have you ever felt like giving up? Have you ever seen friends or classmates give up? And why are they doing it? Is it because they have a fixed mindset and they believe intelligence is fixed and they believe there's nothing they can do to improve? Or could they be exhibiting giving up behavior for other reasons in that moment? Like maybe they had a horrible morning. Maybe they have a family member who's sick. Maybe they're not getting enough sleep and they're just really, what's the adjective for when you don't get enough sleep? You know, cranky. You have a low threshold for stress. And so sometimes you say and do things in the moment that you don't really believe. You could give me better answers here than I can because, you know, you're students right now. It's been a while since I've been a student. The point is that Carol Dweck is probably committing the FAE here. So you're going to read about that. You can also read about the general issue of how evil behavior can be caused by evil traits, and there are some famous social psychologists who believe that evil behavior is caused by evil traits. Now don't get me wrong, evil behavior probably is caused by evil traits, but why does it have to be caused only by evil traits? Do you remember how I said that almost every behavior is usually caused by a combination of personality and situational factors? It's usually both. But there are some famous social psychologists who seem to underestimate the situational factors. So if someone commits an evil behavior against you, yeah, they're evil, but don't stop your thinking there. It could be more than that. There could be some situational factors on top of it. And then, as we've discussed, the evil traits and the situational factors, they can interact with each other in the twisty pretzel. Do you remember the twisty pretzel picture? So it could be evil traits, it could be situational factors, and it could be some interaction between the two of them. The special case of the FAE that I spend the most time talking about in The Power of Context is victim blaming. And I actually already gave you these pages earlier, pages 199 to 215. It's the chapter 8 of the book, and it's all about victim blaming. And victim blaming is part of, or a paraphrase for having just world beliefs, right? So if someone ends up homeless, why did they end up homeless? Well, because they're lazy, or because they didn't work hard enough to keep their jobs. Okay, so poverty and homelessness is one topic here. Natural disasters. I talked about Hurricane Katrina and the flood in New Orleans. And a lot of Americans, I don't know if it's a majority, but there was a subset of Americans who were blaming the victims of Hurricane Katrina for not leaving the city. How could you not leave the city? You knew the flood was coming. You knew this could happen. So just get on one of those buses and leave the city. Well, it wasn't that easy. You know, you need resources to leave the city. You can't just leave the city. And some people did not have access to the buses. So there were situational factors that kept people in New Orleans. A scarier example of natural disasters, sometimes when there are people in this country who suffer a natural disaster, there are other people in this country who blame the views of the victims, who say, oh, those victims, they're too supportive of gay rights. And when you're that supportive of gay rights, you know bad stuff is going to happen to you. This is, you know, God or some kind of fate or karma coming back on you. So first of all, wow. And secondly, that's an example of the fundamental attribution error and victim blaming. And then where it gets interesting, I hope, is in what I call the gray areas. There are some gray areas of victim blaming, meaning some of you might think, oh yeah, this is definitely victim blaming, and others of you might think, no, 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 that's not victim blaming. Why do you think that's victim blaming? Let me see if I can at least talk about one example. One example of a gray area is the American dream, the so-called American dream. Have you heard of that? What is that? So basically, if you work hard enough, you know, if you care enough and you work hard enough, then you can succeed and become rich in this country. That's the American dream. And if you state it another way, you can say if you're not successful, if you're not rich, well then you must not have worked hard enough. Whoa, that's starting to sound like victim blaming. Or is it? So that's the point. What do you think? Is it victim blaming to believe in the American dream? So I want you to read about this, because some people feel, yeah, if you're not rich, that doesn't mean you didn't work hard enough. There are barriers to some people, especially some racial groups and lower socioeconomic status groups. So you can't say just because you're not rich, you didn't work hard enough. That's victim blaming. On the other hand, the American dream is meant to motivate people. The politicians and the educators and the community leaders, they're just trying to motivate you, like, come on, you can do this and we can help you. So that's a gray area. I don't know where you fall on the continuum, but please think about this issue. Please think about whether you think it's victim blaming or not. And then there are two other gray areas. And maybe I'll put this issue into an assignment and I'll give you a chance to talk about it in an essay question or something. Now, before I leave this slide, if I have not said it recently, none of my discussion is trying to say that victims are blameless. It's not that victims are always totally blameless. So victim blaming is more about overstating the personal causes. It's overstating or overly focusing on the victim's faults or the victim's personal characteristics. It's not that the victim has no responsibility. I mean, people who are poor, it's not that they have no responsibility for their outcomes. It's just that most of us overestimate their personal control, and we tend to underestimate the situational factors. So I think you get the idea. So that concludes my formal section on the fundamental attribution error. And now we're going to switch to another type of bias called the actor-observer bias, aka the switch. Now, I hope you remember from the beginning of the semester I defined the FAE earlier and I defined the actor-observer bias earlier, but here in Chapter 3 is when I want to formally discuss the actor-observer bias. And to do so, I'm going to return to that much talked about driving example where someone is tailgating you. They come really fast behind you, and then they swerve around you, and they cut you off, and they speed away. And I have some pictures of tailgating here that I found on the internet. So I don't know if you ever drive with somebody this close to your bumper in the back, and what the heck is going on? Why is this person driving like that? And then, do you remember we had this conversation before, I think? And then, as a thought experiment, after you're done thinking about why that jerk is tailgating you, then as a thought experiment, let's reverse perspectives, and now I want you to think about times that you have been the tailgater. Have you ever tailgated somebody else? Why have you tailgated somebody else? Are you a jerk? Are you that terrible, idiot, aggressive driver that was tailgating you? Or when you explain your own tailgating behavior, do you think about the situational possibilities? Like, well, you know, I'm tailgating somebody else because they're going so darn slow and I'm late to get somewhere. Or maybe you're not even thinking about the fact that you're tailgating because you're from Chicago and you tailgate. Okay, it's just how people drive. Now, I'm not trying to excuse Chicago drivers, and I don't mean to diss Chicago drivers. I'm from Chicago originally. I'm just saying that they drive closer to each other, and maybe it's a cultural thing. Okay, so what's my point? Half of the actor-observer bias is the FAE. That's right, we're not done talking about the FAE. So half of the actor-observer bias is as follows. As the observer of the tailgating, we tend to commit the FAE, and we tend to call the tailgater names like jerk, idiot, aggressive. But as the actor explaining our own behavior, if I'm the actor now and I'm tailgating somebody else and I have to explain my own behavior, well then we tend to make more situational attributions like I'm late for something or the driver ahead of me is going really slow. Or it's no big deal, this is how people drive where I'm from. So the actor-observer bias is two things, as the observer and as the actor. And it is that switch in perspectives. That's why I called it the switch. It is that switch in perspectives from how you explain a behavior that you're observing versus how you're explaining a behavior that you yourself are engaged in. The bottom line here is that most people are naturally two-faced. I think I have some Batman clip art here. Am I right? Is that a villain from Batman? Most of us are naturally two-faced. And there are other names for this in our culture. There are other ways to refer to this. The pot calling the kettle black. Have you heard of that phrase? Should I explain it? So if you're a pot, you know, presumably you're black, and that's like, you know, you being a tailgater. And then you call the kettle, which is also black, you call the kettle black as an insult. You know, like you call the other tailgater names, but you don't call yourself names. So maybe I'm ruining the effectiveness of a cultural saying by trying to explain it. Have you heard of the phrase having double standards, speaking out of both sides of your mouth? Part of what I'm trying to communicate here is that there are so many phrases in our culture, in our society, and by our culture, I guess I just mean in the United States. There are so many phrases for being two-faced, for being a big fat hypocrite, because that's another way to say this, right? This is about hypocrisy, the big H. There are so many phrases to refer to this that it's probably a common thing, and it is a common thing. Committing the actor-observer bias is so common that we have a lot of ways to refer to it that have evolved in our cultural language. The new question, because technically I've referred to the actor-observer bias before today, the new question is, why do so many people commit the actor-observer bias? Now, in the research literature, there are at least two, and maybe one or two more, but at least two accepted reasons for why we commit the actor-observer bias. Number one, ego protection. It's just straightforward ego protection. I don't want to think of myself as a jerk. I don't want to think of myself as an idiot aggressive driver, and so I will come up with external explanations for that. Now, it turns out the actor-observer bias happens even with neutral behaviors, not only negative behaviors. But when the behaviors are negative, the reason is ego protection. We're protecting our egos. It's a normal, self-serving way to think. And it's mentally healthy. It's a mentally healthy way to be, to think this way. People who do not exhibit the actor-observer bias are at greater risk of depression. So that's one reason, ego protection. A second reason, I'm wondering if any of you are thinking about it. A second reason for the actor-observer bias is because I, as the actor, know my own situation better. Right? If you're the tailgater, you know why you're tailgating. If I'm observing you from the side of the highway or from some other car, I don't know why you're tailgating, but you know why you're tailgating. And so if I'm the actor and I'm tailgating, I have more information about my own situation. So the second reason for the actor-observer bias is that the actors know more about their own situations. Duh, right? Now, the difficult issue here in navigating our society is, if I have situational reasons for my own behavior that I can see because I am me, if I have situational reasons for my own behavior, why is it so hard for me to believe that other people have situational reasons for their behavior? It's one of the intellectual, existential challenges for human beings, I think. Maybe I'm overstating that a little bit. Did anyone notice some cognitive dissonance going on in here, by the way? If you did, I'm impressed and I'm glad. There is some cognitive dissonance going on in here, right? Cognitive dissonance, do you remember that? That is the discomfort caused by inconsistency. Yes, it is my favorite theory, and cognitive dissonance is the discomfort caused by inconsistency. Sometimes you can think of cognitive dissonance as the feeling that you have when you get caught being a big fat hypocrite. So people who get caught in the actor-observer bias are probably feeling cognitive dissonance because they're accusing other people of being jerks when they themselves are engaging in the same behavior. So there's an inconsistency there. And one of the ways that we reduce our dissonance is external justification. Do you remember us talking about that in Chapter 1? One of the ways to reduce our dissonance is external justification. And if you explain your own jerky behavior by coming up with external reasons, that is a dissonance reducer. So I hope that makes sense. We are at the end of the Chapter 3 video lecture. I have another Chapter 3 video lecture coming just for the articles, because you have to read 2 journal articles for the Chapter 3 row from the last side of your syllabus. But before I finish this current Chapter 3 video lecture, Roman numeral 3, other potential problems, meaning there's not just the fundamental attribution error and the actor-observer bias. We have other perceptual problems. We have other biases. And I can easily spend another few hours here, but I'm just going to spend another 5 or 10 minutes talking about a couple of other potential problems. And one of them is in your textbook in Chapter 3. Another one of the problems I'm going to talk about is in a later chapter, but I'm going to discuss it here in the Chapter 3 video lecture. Anyway, okay, let's start with belief perseverance. You can probably sound this out. Belief perseverance is how your beliefs persevere even if there is contradictory information out there. Belief perseverance is how your beliefs persevere. You maintain your beliefs even if they've been disproven, even if there's contradictory information out there. Belief perseverance is a normal, mentally healthy way to be. Our beliefs are part of who we are. Not for all of us. Some of us can maintain a distance from our own beliefs. Some of us, we have a belief, it's disproved, and we say, oh, okay, I had this belief, it's been disproven, and now I don't have this belief anymore because it's been disproven. So some of us are capable of doing that. Sounds like the logical way to go. But in reality, most people, they do not change their beliefs just because the beliefs have been disproved. Most people maintain their beliefs persevere. And it's about ego protection. You know, if I have a belief and you tell me that I'm wrong, if I have a belief and you tell me that there's some research that contradicts my belief, them's fighting words, right? Don't tell me that I'm wrong. And so sometimes we dig in even harder. One of the things I want to talk about in the topic of belief perseverance, one of the things I want to talk about is how do we manage it? How do we manage to maintain our beliefs even if they've been disproved? So if I hold a strong belief about something and you tell me, no, Dan, you're wrong, here are 17 research studies that disprove your belief, what am I going to do? What's my comeback? You've just shown me 17 research studies that disprove my belief. How do I come back from that? So I want to talk about some of the ways people come back from that. I want to talk about some of the practical, down-to-earth, everyday ways that people can maintain their beliefs even though they've been disproven. Now, if you don't mind, let's talk about climate change. Let's talk about the fact that the climate is changing and humans are partially responsible for that. And there are some in our country who don't believe it, even though there are hundreds, if not thousands, of studies and 99.9% of scientists who all say, yes, human-caused climate change is real. All right, well, that belief that climate change is not real, the belief that climate change is not happening, that belief has been disproven. But how do people hang on to it? So I'm sorry, should I not pick such a specific example? It's just an example. I'm just going to roll with it. Okay, one of the ways is we can criticize the source of the information. And so if there are scientists who are saying climate change is real, we can criticize the scientists. We can even call them names. Name calling is an example of criticizing the source. We can also misremember the source. So maybe I have read the 17 or 117 studies that disprove my belief, but after having a few drinks and forgetting about it for a few weeks, I could forget about it. I could kind of misremember it. So maybe I won't completely forget about it, but maybe I could misremember it. And so if it was 117 articles that disproved my belief, maybe I could say, well, yeah, there was some disagreement in the literature. Maybe there were a dozen studies that disproved my belief, when actually it was 117 studies. So that's an exaggerated example of misremembering the source. Another possibility is to avoid the source. Maybe I know there's research that disproves my belief, and I choose not to read it. I'm just going to avoid the source. I'm not going to talk to scientists. I'm definitely not going to watch any news show that has scientists as guests, and I'm not going to read the research. So this is part of what's called the confirmation bias, which is either in Chapter 3 or in an earlier chapter. And the confirmation bias, we avoid contradictory information. We read the information that supports our beliefs. We avoid the information that contradicts our beliefs. My examples are kind of exaggerated. If you know somebody who exhibits these practices to an extreme degree, that's not necessarily mentally healthy, but to moderate degree, maintaining your beliefs and using some of these strategies to maintain your beliefs. To a moderate degree, this is normal, this is mentally healthy, and people who don't show belief perseverance are more likely to be depressed. But you can see some problems here, right? When there are actually 117 research studies that disprove your belief, it would probably be wise to find a way to change your beliefs. Another potential problem, another bias that I want to talk about in Chapter 3 is called pluralistic ignorance. Now, I'm taking this definition from a later chapter, page 289, so you will come across it later in the main textbook. But I believe it's relevant here in Chapter 3 because pluralistic ignorance is partially about the fundamental attribution error. So first, let me read the definition here. From the main textbook, it's a false impression of what most other people are thinking or feeling. It's a bias. It's a false impression of what most other people are thinking or feeling. Now, the reason I'm talking about it in Chapter 3 is because of the reason for the false impression. Most, but not all, most pluralistic ignorance research says the reason for the false impression is that we're underestimating situational factors. Ooh, that sounds familiar. Yeah, underestimating situational factors is the main part of the fundamental attribution error. So here's an example. I don't know if you've ever been in a math class where no one has any questions, meaning no one raises their hand and asks a question. So let's take your typical calculus class. The professor is up at the board doing all sorts of proofs on the board, and then the professor turns to you and says, "Does anyone have any questions?" And nobody raises their hand. Why is nobody raising their hand? Now let's say you're in this class and you have a bunch of questions. You are confused. But you look around the room and nobody's raising their hand. And you say to yourself, well, they're not raising their hand, so they must not have a question. They must understand everything. I don't understand anything right now. I'm really confused, but nobody else is raising their hand, so they must understand it. The problem is that other people in the class are looking at you and you're not raising your hand either. Did you notice that in the story here? You're not raising your hand either, and people are looking at you, and people are looking at me, Dan, and they're saying, okay, well, Dan's not raising his hand. He must understand. He must not have any questions either. But I do have questions. And so you could have a math class where every student has questions, but everybody thinks that everybody else understands, when actually, what's going on? In a math class, sometimes there is pressure not to ask a question because you don't want to look stupid, right? You don't want to look stupid. There's a group phenomenon happening. You don't want to stick out. You don't want to seem like the only one who doesn't understand. That is a situational force. You don't want to seem to everybody else like you don't understand. And so you don't raise your hand. Nobody raises their hand. And then everybody misunderstands each other. That's the false impression that we can form of each other. Okay, my last example. And there's some interesting research here that I think I'm assigning you later in the semester. When you look at other drinkers at a party, so I don't know if you've been at a party where people are drinking, but suppose that you've been at a party where people are drinking and you look at them drinking, you know, they've got the beer in their hand and they're drinking it, and you're wondering, why are they drinking? Why are all these people around me drinking? And let's say you have a beer in your hand and you're drinking also. So what research has shown is that when you look at the other drinkers at a party and you try to understand why they're drinking, what we usually conclude is that the other drinkers are drinking because they're comfortable drinking. It's not rocket science. If you're doing something, you're probably comfortable doing it, right? They're drinking, they're probably comfortable drinking. Who, me? I'm drinking, but I'm not actually that comfortable doing it. You know, I mean, it's okay, but I'm doing it because I'm at a party, and this is what you're supposed to do at parties. But you look at other people, they're doing it, they must be comfortable with it. Again, the problem here is that the other drinkers are looking at you drinking. So the other drinkers are looking at me, Dan. Okay, well, Dan's drinking. Dan must be comfortable drinking. So we're all looking at each other thinking that we're comfortable drinking when fewer of us are than it actually appears. And again, we're underestimating the power of the situation, namely the social norms. There's a social norm in college that drinking is cool. There's a social norm in college that drinking is okay. It's something to be comfortable with. Now, the article that I think I'm assigning you later in the semester shows that comfort with drinking is a misperceived norm. The comfort level in college with drinking is a misperceived norm. It's part of pluralistic ignorance. We misperceive how comfortable other people are with drinking because when we look at them drinking, we commit fundamental attribution error, and we think they're drinking because they're comfortable drinking, when actually more students are drinking not because they're comfortable with it, but because of the social norm that it's supposed to be something that college students do and it's cool. Again, I might be exaggerating some of these examples, but that's a classic example of pluralistic ignorance. And maybe I'll put a call out here for the article that I'm citing, and I will double check that I am going to assign that article later in the semester. So I am finished with this Chapter 3 video lecture. It's mostly about the fundamental attribution error, right? But that's partly why I wanted to include this last slide, to show that there are some other biases. Even though the FAE is part of pluralistic ignorance is more broad than the FAE. Okay, I might have passed the hour point at this point. That's okay. Take care, everybody. Talk to you soon.